Hello, and welcome again to Living the Resurrection, this Bible study that we're doing, looking at some of these great resurrection sort of texts from both the Gospels and then the letters of Paul. We're doing this in a way of trying to remind ourselves the resurrection or the Easter story, the resurrection of Jesus, isn't something simply to be believed, but it's something to be experienced and lived out. I've just made a super important discovery, and that is when doing these recordings, make sure I turn my phone off because I was 6 minutes into it and I got a phone call, which actually was just an accident, but I'm deciding to sort of redo this. So I've learned my lesson. I will remember. So today we get to look at Paul's two passages from Paul's letter to the Colossians. So let me just do some introduction to this letter. It's one of Paul's shortest letters, and it's a part of those letters that are usually considered the prison epistles: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And it's definitely a letter that is connected to that little letter of Philemon. There are names: Onesimus, Tychicus are names mentioned in both the Colossian letter and in the letter to Philemon. So we see the connection between those two letters. Colossians was probably written in the early to mid 50s. And remember, that means we're talking about something in the neighborhood of 20 years after Jesus was crucified, was resurrected, and then ascended into heaven. So there's still plenty of people around to talk with who would have known Jesus and would have been a part, you might say, of the ground floor of the Jesus story. Colossae was a city in southwestern Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. It was not a significant city. Ephesus, the letter we were in last week, Ephesians, Ephesus was a significant place. It was large, very urban population, important cultural, philosophical, religious center. Colossae was none of those things. It was a small place. It had been overshadowed by surrounding communities. One of them was Laodicea, which is a city and a church mentioned in the book of Revelation. Also, Hierapolis was another important place. Colossae sat on the Lycus River, and if there was one compelling thing about it, it was this: that it sat at the crossroads, both north, south, and east-west. It sat at these crossroads. Whenever that happened, whenever a city was in a place like that, it meant there were a lot of other kinds of people in your town. People who were traveling, merchants, teachers, a lot of different people, and their ideas were coming through. So Colossae undoubtedly was a place with different ethnic groups, different religious and philosophical ways of thinking were represented there. And I think we see that in the letter to the Colossians. The city of Colossae has not actually been excavated as of yet, although I have read that there are plans to do so. But right now, there's basically just a mound, and they know that the city is under that. That mound would be called a tell, and they know that as they dig through that tell, that they're going to find successive levels of the ancient city of Colossae. So the purpose of the letter, and here there comes usually a little bit of controversy between scholars. They're always looking for something that they can fight about. And here's the way that fight turns up with the Colossian letter. And it has to do with what was the purpose of Paul's writing. It's always worth reminding ourselves, Paul never wrote just general letters like, "Hi, how are you? I'm doing great. I hope you're doing well." That wasn't ever why he wrote a letter. His letters were almost always occasioned by something specific. There was something happening at a place that then Paul felt compelled to respond or answer to or give guidance to these young churches. So what was happening in Colossae? Two possibilities. N.T. Wright, who I think it's always best to agree with N.T. Wright. Wright says that he thinks principally the issue had to do with Jews who had become Christians who were now saying that simply following Jesus wasn't enough. That had to be supplemented with Jewish practice. Others, and here's a place where I think there's good reason for supposing there was more going on than only the Jewish affairs. Others say that Colossians was written because of other religious beliefs and practices, not just Jewish, but also mystery religions, pagan type views, Greek philosophy, things coming from the East, that this amalgam, it's sometimes called syncretism. Syncretism means taking the Christian faith and then saying, I'm going to merge it together with some of these other things that I previously believed, and I'm going to now sort of bring those together. So many scholars think that Paul is writing to address the issue of syncretism. It's clear when we read Colossians that there are both Jewish and pagan ideas referenced. Paul writes about the Sabbath in 2:16, circumcision in 2:11 and following, food laws in 2:21, but pagan ideas that are referenced. There's Paul writes about the powers in 1:16, 2, 8, 10, and 15. The worship of angels, which could have been Jewish as well, in 2:18. Asceticism is the idea that I don't eat a lot, I deny myself any pleasure, and because that's the way I get closer to God. That's in 2:21 through 23. There's mention of festivals in 2:16. A number of different references to wisdom, 1:9, and chapter 2:3, and verse 23, chapter 3:16. I think it's best to see that Paul is writing to both these sort of issues, some Jewish tendencies, perhaps among the Christians, also tendencies to merge Christian faith with other ideas that they had held to previously. What's interesting to note is Paul's strategy for writing. He doesn't so much write about specific practices. He mentions that the idea of Jewish observances of Sabbath, but he doesn't go after that then. He's not trying to specifically respond to each particular specific piece that perhaps people were saying that they believed. What he does, his way of answering those specific, you might call them add-ons to Christian faith, is to emphasize the supremacy, the overarching supremacy of Jesus Christ. Colossians, for such a short letter, has some stunning Jesus passages in it. Colossians 1:15 through 20, I sort of entitle that the cosmic reach of Christ and his work. Then Colossians 2:9 through 15, one of the passages we looked at. Christ is the fullness of God, and then his work on the cross. Chapter 2:16 to 19, reality is found in Christ, he's the head. 3:1 through 4, Christ rules from the right hand of the Father. So these really great passages about Christ and how Christ is enough. Let me read a couple of quotes. Both of these come from N.T. Wright. Wright summarizes the message of Colossians like this: the church must look nowhere else for forgiveness for the past, for maturity in the present, or for future hope. And then he writes, Paul is not writing what we might think as a standard theological treatise, beginning with doctrine, ending with ethic or practical teaching. For him, all is doctrine, all is practice, all is worship, because all is Christ. And then I want to read to you the introduction to Colossians that comes from Eugene Peterson's The Message. Regardless of what you think of Peterson's work in translation, he has absolutely fantastic introductions to each of the books of the Bible. It's just worth having a copy of The Message just for his book introductions. Here's how he introduces Colossians. Hardly anyone who hears the full story of Jesus and learns the true facts of his life and teaching, crucifixion and resurrection, walks away with a shrug of the shoulders, dismissing him as unimportant. People ignorant of the story or misinformed about it, of course, regularly dismiss him. But with few exceptions, the others know instinctively that they are dealing with the most remarkable greatness. But it is quite common for those who consider him truly important to include others who seem to be equally important in his company: Buddha, Moses, Socrates, and Muhammad for a historical start, along with some personal favorites. For these people, Jesus is important, but not central. His prestige is considerable, but he is not preeminent. The Christians in the town of Colossae, or at least some of them, seem to have been taking this line. For them, cosmic forces of one sort or another were getting equal billing with Jesus. Paul writes to them in an attempt to restore Jesus, the Messiah, to the center of their lives. The way he makes his argument is as significant as the argument he makes. Claims for the uniqueness of Jesus are common enough, but such claims about Jesus are frequently made with an arrogance that is completely incompatible with Jesus himself. Sometimes the claims are enforced with violence. But Paul, although unswervingly confident in the conviction that Christ occupies the center of creation and salvation without peers, is not arrogant, and he is certainly not violent. He argues from a position of rooted humility. He writes with the energies of most considerate love. He exhibits again what Christians have come to appreciate so much in Paul: the wedding of a brilliant and uncompromising intellect with a heart that is warmly and wonderfully kind. Isn't that nice? How can we be people? I like to think of it like this. How can we be people of both conviction, but also humility? Both of those things, not one or the other. If we only have conviction, we end up arrogant. If we only have humility, then we're always surrendering what it is that we believe. But how can we have both? Real conviction about what is true, especially about the person of Jesus, and then a humility as we share that Jesus with others. We're going to get to look at how Paul does that. The two passages that we're looking at are Colossians 2, 6 through 15. And then the second passage, I ask you to read Colossians 3, 1 to 11. But as I've been working on this, I realized I cut it off too quick. I want us to go 3, 1 through 14 instead of just 1 through 11. If all we read is through 11, in essence, what we see is what Paul tells the Christians in Colossae not to do. In the next few verses, he tells them what to do. And the Christian life is both of those pieces. It is both what ought we not do, and then how should we live in response to the person of Jesus Christ. So we're going to get to talk about these pieces together on Tuesday evening. Let me ask you these questions. Here is just a general question for Colossians. And I will, again, these will be included in my email, so even if you don't catch them now, you'll have them in front of you. Colossians is written in part to answer those who would say that faith in Christ is not enough, that something has to be added to Christ. We can guess from Paul's letter to the Colossians what the add-ons were. What are the add-ons in our day? What do people who think, no, Christ is not enough, there is more, what does the more entail, or what does it look like? And then I have a couple questions connected to our first reading, 2, 9 through 15. Consider this sentence: for in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. Or the Message translation says, everything of God gets expressed in Christ, so you can see and hear him clearly. What does the incarnation or the gospel stories tell you about the nature of God? If it is true that all the fullness of God is in Christ, then what can we tell about God by looking at Jesus? Second, my second question for this section, Paul has an expansive view of what was happening on the cross. Based on chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, what was God doing through the cross? Make a little list of what Paul says. Here's what transpired on the cross. And then Colossians 3 1 to, what did I say, 1 to 14. Here's 3 questions in that section. How do you understand chapter 3, verse 2? Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. Doesn't this lead to Christians being, quote, so heavenly minded that they are no earthly good? Isn't that what Paul's suggesting? What do you think about that? The next question is, what does Paul mean when he tells us your life is now hidden with Christ in God? I find that a really compelling idea, but I'm not altogether sure what it means. So what does it mean that our life is hidden with Christ in God? And then the final question would be this. In Paul's view, the Christian life is composed of both saying no and saying yes. Is Paul legalistic when he suggests this? When he gives these lists and tells people, don't do this, is that legalistic? How important is it that today we live in particular ways with both the no and the yes? It's not no or yes, it's both of them. So how do those things figure into our Christian lives? That's all that I have until we meet together and talk about the passage itself. Just always want to give you just a little bit of background information. Colossians is a wonderful letter, just really, really great stuff in such a short little letter. I encourage you, it doesn't take long to read the entirety of Colossians. Read the whole thing and then look at our 2 particular sections. I'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. You'll be seeing me tomorrow. Remember, worship tomorrow at Christ Lutheran is at 9:15. We've moved our time an hour and a half earlier, just to give people an opportunity who want to get into their days. And now that things are opening up a little bit, people want to, just get into the day, go for a walk, go to a park, take a ride. And so that's why we are worshiping earlier. Of course, you can always watch worship at any time afterward once it gets uploaded to YouTube. But the live stream is happening at 9:15. So come and worship with us. And then I'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. So blessings to you, and I'll look forward to our time together again.